This is the Zhiyun X100RGB, and it's a super portable light that packs both power and versatility. But this video isn't just going to be me talking about specs and features. Today I'm going to walk you through step by step through 3 different but practical lighting setups using this light, so that you can judge for yourself if you think it'll work well for your work. These setups are fairly universal, and the best part is every one of these is something you can practice for yourself right at home. This video is sponsored by Zhiyun, but my goal here is for you to come away learning something you can use for yourself on your next shoot. Let's get started. Now, I'll keep this brief, but I do want to give you a quick overview of this light so that you have context to the way it was designed. This is the RGB version of one of Zhiyun's previous lights, the Zhiyun X100. However, because this is a product collaboration with fellow YouTuber Cam Mackey, there are a few key design decisions that set this light up to be pretty versatile. For starters, it's a 100-watt fixture, which for a light that is only slightly wider than the footprint of your average smartphone, that's fairly impressive. On the bottom, we have 2 ⅛ mounting points for easy rigging. It can be powered by a DC power brick, Type-C power delivery off of a power bank, or with this detachable battery, which has a capacity of about 2,500 milliamp hours. Where this light gets interesting though is with the included and optional modifiers. Zhiyun designed a mini 40cm softbox, spotlight attachment, and a mini Fresnel lens with magnetic barn doors for the X100RGB. So basically they took existing tools that people like myself use on a daily basis on larger lights and shrunk them to fit into a tiny case to make traveling with them easier. Let's see what this light can do. Interview or talking head lighting is by far the most practical setup anyone with a camera should understand. You will probably set up this kind of lighting more than anything else. Because the setup is so common, it's also easy to let the little nuances slip, leaving you with an okay image that could have been much better. I started by framing a shot in my living room, shooting towards the corner of the room facing the large window. I did this for 2 reasons. First, shooting into the corner of a room will give you the greatest amount of depth no matter what room you walk into. Secondly, I wanted to make sure I had a clear way to motivate the direction of my key light. By having the window on the right, I can now set my key light on the same side as the window, and overall, the shot will feel more natural, which is personally something I aim for. You will generally want to expose your camera to the part of the image that you cannot control, which in my case here is the windows. Once the camera was set, I now had the foundation to start making my lighting decisions. I'm going to show you 3 different ways you can modify the X100RGB for an interview shot like this. Let's start with the simplest option, this 40cm softbox that Zhiyun makes specifically for the X100 form factor. The main thing I was focused on here with a smaller source like this is getting it at a distance that maintains feeling soft and natural with a light output level that balances well with the background exposure. The moment the intensity of a key light gets too bright is usually when the shot starts to feel unnatural or lit. When people refer to a shot as feeling lit, it's usually due to a key light being set too bright relative to the subject and background, or that the light falls off too quickly on the talent, which usually means the source is too small. Now, to make the shot feel even more natural but still travel friendly, I took the front diffusion of this 40cm softbox off, backed the light up, and put up this 5-in-1 reflector diffusion. This gives us a much larger soft source of light, while still being a travel friendly modifier since these reflectors fold down and pack away relatively small. The reason I'm keeping the softbox on the light here is because it helps us control the spill from the light bouncing everywhere in the room, which would add unwanted light to the scene. If you happen to need more power for a setup like this, you could always take off the softbox and put on the Fresnel lens with the barn doors, and you get a similar level of spill control with more output. Given our distance from the subject though, I only had this light at 35% with the softbox on, which should give you an idea of how bright this light is when used at an interview distance. One tip for using a large diffusion like this is make sure your light is backed up enough to fill the entire diffusion as evenly as possible, or else you aren't taking advantage of the full surface area of your modifier, making your light not as soft as it could be. If you don't require a super minimal modifier, another setup you could do with the X100RGB is to adapt it to Bowen's mount, allowing you to use modifiers built for larger lights. So the next thing I tried was this 36-inch Bowen's softbox to see what this would look like. I also personally like throwing a shower curtain over softboxes like this, which creates this waterfall of light. This makes your softbox ever so slightly softer, and it's one of those 1% tricks that can make a shot feel slightly more polished. Totally optional, but something I do all the time. Now, for the background of this shot, I used the Zhiyun G300 bouncing into the ceiling of the room to set our ambient light. The reason I'm using a much more powerful light than my key light for the background like this is because if you're doing a long interview and you want to maintain the continuity as the natural light changes in the room throughout the day, having a relatively powerful light in the background gives you the headroom to bring up the background light as needed, which when done correctly extends the time that you can keep shooting. The last light I used for this shot is a Zhiyun C100 tube light that I boomed over Sophia to make it feel like she was being lit by the back window. Personally, I'm a fan of centering my backlight as much as possible to hit both shoulders and give a nice edge around talent. Restraint is important with a backlight like this though, because it's very easy to make it too strong and make the shot feel fake. It's also entirely optional because it may not always fit your scene. As a bonus addition, I tried adding some negative fill to option a slightly more dramatic look. I used a slip-on black floppy with this frame here, but you could use anything from a black moving blanket to a black piece of foam core from the dollar store to do the same thing. My goal here was just to cut off the return light we were getting from the ceiling and the brighter white surfaces around the room. If you are already shooting in a room that has a lot of dark surfaces, setting up negative fill wouldn't be necessary. In this case, I think I preferred the higher key, less contrasty look that we had before the negative fill, but I encourage you to try this for yourself so you get a sense of what you like and what you don't like. For this next setup, I wanted to light another common scenario you will come across, and that's a seamless backdrop. This is the kind of scenario that is always really fun to practice because you can't rely on an amazing location to make up for the look. For this setup, I wanted to try the budget version of a beauty commercial look, so I set the X100RGB with the Bones mount adapter and an 85cm lantern softbox. Positioning wise, I set this as a front light just above frame to minimize shadows and create as flattering a light as possible on the face. Because the X100RGB is so tiny, I was able to raise this light right up to the ceiling, making the most of the space in the room. I chose a lantern softbox here because it pulled double duty by not only being our key light, but also adding to the ambient light filling in other parts of this shot. For some extra fill light, I also added a white underbounce with 2 pieces of foam core to even out the shadows on Sophia's face. With the key light set, I used the C100 tube light rigged towards the center of the backdrop, pointing directly down onto the background. The result of this was a nice even gradient down this gray backdrop. Lastly, I used the G300 as a hard backlight raised over the center of the backdrop from behind, pointed down onto Sophia. I warmed the light up slightly to add some color contrast and get some more separation from the background. Here's what this looks like altogether. To push this look further and add more depth, I added some cheap shears from IKEA in the foreground and background, put a fan on each one to get some movement in the shot, and set my camera to 120 FPS. Here's what we ended up with. I think front light as a lighting position isn't talked about that much since it feels like it inherently lacks depth, but I feel like it's possible to add depth in other parts of your shot to make up for any perceived lack of contrast on your subject. Studio setups like this can feel challenging because you are creating all the light from scratch. The fun part of a setup like this though is that it doesn't have to feel natural, so you are open to a lot of experimentation. If you get creative, you can do a lot with just 3 lights and a single modifier like we have here. On a larger scale, this setup would probably be done with a much larger frame on a much bigger set, but the principles and placement of light would be similar, so for a budget look from a tiny portable light you can take anywhere, this works well. Now, for our last setup, I wanted to try a full color contrast look that you might use in a performance music video. To keep this simple, we're going to reuse our gray backdrop just to show you how much you can change the look with a few small tweaks. I'm only going to use 2 lights for this setup. For the key, I'm using the C100 tube light, setting it to pink and pushing it through this 4x4 of quarter grid. I'm using a very thin diffusion here because when you are lighting with colors, your light levels will be drastically lower than when you are lighting with a normal color temperature range. So you have to compensate for that in the diffusion's light loss. The position was the same as our last setup, and I also kept the white underbounce for fill. For the backlight, I took the X100RGB, added on the spotlight attachment, positioned it as a center backlight behind the backdrop, and changed the color to blue. Next, I turned on my hazer, filled the room with a light layer of haze so that we could see the beam of light from the spotlight attachment. This also slightly lowered the contrast of the overall shot, which I liked. I attempted at one point to create a shape with the G300 and a spotlight attachment, but I ended up not liking it that much and decided to simplify the setup by removing it entirely. I find that sometimes the fewer lights that I can use to get the result I want, the better the shot looks overall. Restraint in your choices can be a great thing. Here's how this 2-light RGB setup looks. If you made it this far into the video, I hope one of the setups today inspired you to practice lighting for yourself or try something new on your next project. We are in a time now where you don't need a huge crew and super expensive gear to get a great looking image. There's also no one right way to light a shot, so just focus on practicing and developing your own taste. I hope this gave you a sense of the range of scenarios that the X100RGB can be used in. If you're looking for your first light and you want something to test your creativity, this could be a good option for you. I'll leave links to everything showcased in this video below. A huge thank you to my wife Sophia for being the talent for this video. If you're looking for another lighting video, I have a playlist linked here with other videos where I've discussed lighting on this channel. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. See you next time.